Hello, my name is Jake, and today we'll be talking about the cause and effect of the Civil War. The first event that we will be talking about is the Underground Railroad. Who was involved in the Underground Railroad? Harriet Tubman, who was a famous conductor of the Underground Railroad, had helped about 300 slaves escape. Isaac T. Hopper was the Quaker abolitionist who organized the Underground Railroad. What was happening in the Underground Railroad? It was essentially an underground and secret means of escape and resistance to slavery. Where and when was this happening? The slaves would escape from border states in the South, like Kentucky, Virginia, and Maryland, and bring them to northern states or to Canada. Why was the Underground Railroad such an important event? The Underground Railroad was a way of rebellion for the slaves and a way of escape, and it meant that it was a secretive and reliable way for the slaves to escape. Now, the effect of the Underground Railroad. About 100,000 enslaved people escaped slavery. It divided the North and South even more, and would later affect the fugitive slave law. The efforts of the railroad would later happen on the surface instead of keeping a secret. The next event that we'll be talking about is the Missouri Compromise. Who was involved in the Missouri Compromise? Henry Clay, a congressman who played a significant role in the compromise. What happened in the Missouri Compromise? Missouri was admitted as a slave state, and Maine was admitted as a non-slave state. It outlawed slavery above the southern boundary of Missouri. Where and when was this happening? It was happening in the United States on March 2nd of 1820. Why was the Missouri Compromise important? It temporarily settled the division of the North and South and divided the states among the sides. What was the effect of the Missouri Compromise? It equally divided the power of states among the sides, being the North and South. Maine would be a non-slave state, and Missouri would be a slave state. The next topic we'll be talking about is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Who was involved in Uncle Tom's Cabin? Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. What was happening? Uncle Tom's Cabin tells the story of Uncle Tom, who was an enslaved person. This novel was popular among the North, but hated among the South. Where and when was this happening? It happened in the United States, New Orleans, in 1852. Why was this important? 300,000 copies were sold within a year. It strengthened the abolitionism in the North, and it weakened the Southern cause. It showed the issues of slavery and the suffering slaves had felt. What was the effect of the novel? It divided the country even more. It strengthened abolitionism and northern cause, while the southern cause grew weaker. The next event is Bleeding Kansas. Who was involved in Bleeding Kansas? Pro-slavery, free staters, and abolitionists were all political parties that fought for certain ideals and were involved in Bleeding Kansas. What was happening? It started when Kansas was being voted into a slave or non-slave state. The violence continued when it was admitted as a non-slave state under the Union. All the political groups fought among each other, and an example of the violence is the massacre at Pottawatomie Creek. Where and when was this happening? In eastern Kansas and western Missouri from 1854 to 1861. Why is this an important event? It was part of the political issues throughout the U.S. before the Civil War. The Bleeding Kansas period was a significant showing of violence that would occur. Effect. This brought the U.S. to the division of the North and South, and it showed the great amount of violence that would occur during the Civil War. It also contributed to the coming Civil War as the Union gained one more state than the Confederacy.
John Brown's raid took place October 16, 1859 at Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. John Brown was known as a radical abolitionist who hated slavery and wanted to put an end to it. Brown was well known because of his past actions, such as his participation in the Underground Railroad, fighting in the Bleeding of Kansas, and creation of the League of Gileadites. Brown decided that he wanted to end slavery once and for all. His plan was to go and raid the arsenal on Harper's Ferry, and the surrounding slaves in the area, upon hearing the news, would try to free themselves from their masters and join Brown's cause. Using the arsenal supplies, Brown planned to distribute the weapons to rebel slaves. Of his new army, Brown was set on traveling the South, freeing slaves from their owners and encouraging slaves to rise up and fight against their captors. Brown did not take into effect, however, how heavily guarded the arsenal was going to be, and this resulted in the plan's failure. He was surrounded by the morning and captured then by Robert E. Lee, then hung with his surviving men not long after. The effect of John Brown's raid were both immediate and long term. In the short term, the raid served to further inflame the already heated debate over slavery in the United States. Sectional distrust was already high, but after the event, tensions were even higher. The raid also resulted in the death of several people, including Brown himself. In the long term, the raid helped to contribute to the outbreak of the Civil War. The 1860 election had four candidates, those being Republican Abraham Lincoln, Democratic John Breckinridge, Constitutional Union John Bell, and Democratic Stephen Douglas. The result of the election ended in Abe's victory, winning 60% of the Electoral College, but only 40% of the popular vote. The South was in disarray, not being able to find someone to nominate as a party candidate. The South Party then split into two, basically guaranteeing Lincoln's victory. Although no state which seceded had a single vote for Lincoln, he still won the popular vote and electoral ballots. The 1860 election was a turning point in American history. The Southern states were outraged by Lincoln's victory and not long after seceded from the Union. The election of Abraham Lincoln as the 16th President of the United States signaled the end of an era of good feeling and the beginning of the sectional crisis that would eventually lead to the Civil War. There were 11 states that seceded from the Union, with those being South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, with Jefferson Davis as their president. South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 10, 1860, and was followed by 10 other states, with North Carolina being the last state, seceding on June 8, 1861. Slavery was the South's way of life, and Lincoln being the new president made many Southerners think that Lincoln would take away their slaves. The built-up tension from the previous years was finally giving in, and the Civil War was inevitable. The seceded states had a convention in Alabama in February of 1861 and created the Confederate Constitution, like the U.S. original Constitution, more focused on state rights. This created the Confederate States of America, and not long after, the Civil War began. The firing in Fort Sumter began on April 12, 1861, and lasted till April 14, 1861. Major Robert Anderson sneakily stationed himself and his men onto Fort Sumter because their old station area was in bad condition. When the people of South Carolina found out, they viewed this as a threat. They asked Anderson to surrender several times, with Anderson refusing each time, even though he was massively outgunned, outmanned, and had extremely limited supplies. Charleston Harbor was an important port to the South, and Fort Sumter was of interest to the South as well. After refusing to surrender, General P.G.T. Beauregard got orders to take the fort, so on April 12, 1861, he ordered his men to fire upon the fort. Beauregard's attack lasted 36 hours, and the Union troops surrendered. The battle ended in sudden victory with no casualties besides one horse. The firing of Fort Sumter had a number of effects. Most importantly, it effectively began the Civil War. 4 years of brutal conflict that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. Second, it galvanized public opinion in the North in favor of the Union cause. Third, it led to a number of military actions in the days and weeks that followed. As both sides scrambled to prepare for war, Lincoln and Jefferson sent out calls for volunteer soldiers, and both sides had very eager men ready to fight for what they believed. On January 1, 1863, in the city of Washington, the Emancipation Proclamation, an executive order issued by President Abraham Lincoln, declared that all slaves in rebellious states were to be free. Although the proclamation did not immediately free all slaves, it was a crucial step in the process of ending slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation was written to give new meaning to the war. It was once a war about uniting the country, but turned to one about freedom and slavery. The proclamation was also used militarily. After repeated defeats, the Union civilians and soldiers were unmotivated to keep fighting the war. The proclamation was a change of the reason to fight, and it raised morale and brought in African American soldiers into the military. It also helped avoid European intervention with the war, with powers like Britain not wanting to fight for a side protecting slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation was one of the most important documents in American history. It declared that all slaves in the United States were to be free. This had an enormous impact on the Civil War. It made it a war about freedom and not just about state rights. It also showed that Abraham Lincoln was committed to ending slavery, which helped encourage people to fight for the Union and increase in African American rights.